here in the Northeast, right, we've been having an amazing spout with great weather, right? Yesterday was absolutely incredible. If my pool did not say it was 47 degrees, I would have tried putting a foot into it, but I chose otherwise. However, I think we're going to do Mila's baptism again, and so we're going to use our pool to do that, and it's only 47 degrees. You'll be fine. Don't worry. You'll be okay. I hate surprise parties. I don't know what it is. I'm just not, I don't know. I'm one of those guys when you're at the restaurant and they start singing, happy birthday to you, and then everyone's chiming in, and then, especially in an Italian restaurant, and all these guys think they, should be operatic singers, and they all come over and they do this whole thing, and they're all standing around. And then the thing to me is, first of all, they bring out a piece of cake this big, okay? Now look, okay? And, okay. So, all right, and then you're stuck there with the little candle, and you got to blow the thing. I don't like surprises like that. Actually, what I dislike even more than that is going to other people's surprise parties. See, because this is the problem, and we have one coming up. So, okay, they shove you all into a room, okay? Shh, they're coming, shh. You get the whole thing, right? They're coming. And then someone says this, hide. Where do you put something my size that could possibly, come on. I'm too big. I don't fit anywhere. Hide, But it's all part of the surprise. Everyone tucks themselves into a corner. And anyway, surprises. I would not have done well with Jesus' appearances, is my point, okay? There's something about the fact that this individual comes and goes as he likes and makes his appearances despite you have done everything in your power to make sure no one could get in, and he still gets in. And then he stands there and says, peace be with you. Are you kidding me? You just popped up out of nowhere and you want me to be at peace? How many of us have seen a resurrected person being there? I think we have made this very sanitary, this experience, because we're not comfortable with the reality that these disciples, they were told that Jesus rose from the dead. They saw the empty tomb. There was a bunch of women who, because they are not really trustworthy as far as the law system of the day, would not take a woman's word on anything. But these women are saying that they saw this Jesus, and Jesus says that I will come and I will be with you. And so these men now are terrified because you have the Romans and you have the Jews all looking for him because they follow this man Jesus. And you have a bunch of crazy women who said, oh, by the way, they saw him along the road and that, he's coming to visit. Then you hide. Right? You try to hide yourself. It's probably the smallest room they possibly can find. They barricade the door because they're terrified of the Jews. And despite all of their huddling and all of their secrecy, and despite the fact of everything else, Jesus appears in their presence. But I want to suggest one other thing. I don't think their fear was just of the Jews. I really don't. I think their fear was that Jesus would come. I think their fear was that what the woman said was accurate. I think their fear was that this Jesus, whom they all betrayed, denied, and isolated and abandoned to die alone on the cross, that this one that they were following, this one that they loved, this one that they cared about, they all did a terrible job at being faithful disciples. And I think the door was locked because they figured, hey, there's no way that even Jesus could get through, and you know what? I'm okay with that because I don't really want to encounter him. Because the question is, what do I say? What words do I use to express how I'm feeling at this moment in time when these women who have been with us for a very long time, and probably they know are trustworthy, have said that this Jesus is resurrected, and yet they all know that they have done a terrible job of being faithful followers of this person, Jesus. And so I think the door was bolted, not just to keep the Jews and the Romans out. I think they were hoping it would keep Jesus out. And I think for some of us, we do the same thing. I think for some of us, even if we call ourselves disciples, we can have ourselves locked in a room for fear that this Jesus would appear and come into our presence because we're embarrassed by the lives that we live, that we're embarrassed that we're not as faithful as we would like to be, that we're not as proactive of being like Christ in thought, word, and deed. And so I think we are terrified that this Jesus will show up, and when he shows up, then we're stuck standing there. And I think the mention of peace is really a very profound statement. First of all, recognize these are exactly the people who abandoned Jesus when he needed them most. They spent 3 years with this guy. They spent 3 years. It's like being a really close friend with someone and then they're getting sick and then you're not showing up. Or they're in the process of dying and you're not contacting them. It is that type of intimacy, that type of relationship. And yet in the midst of all that, they abandon him because they are afraid for their own lives and they don't care about what happens to him. Maybe they care, but they're not willing to put their own lives at risk for that other person, right? So we have to talk about this the way it is. And so they all go and they all huddle and they're all ashamed, and in their shame, they lock themselves in and they're hoping that Jesus does not show up. But the reality of the matter here is that Jesus, after rising from the dead, he appears to the women at the tomb, and then who is the next group that he goes to? Who is the next group that he actually goes to visit and to be with? It's exactly the ones who abandoned him. It's exactly the ones who did him wrong, if you will. It's exactly the ones who were not faith-filled. They weren't perfect. They really were lousy at being disciples, and they didn't understand any of this, and their fear took the best of them and drove them away, and now they're hiding, and they're all hiding, and they're all clutched up, and they're all terrified physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, being they're terrified that if this Jesus is real, if he comes, what am I going to say? And yet, where is the first place that Jesus goes? It's back to the very same people who abandoned and isolated him. And yet again, here we have an example of how Jesus manifests within himself the characteristics of God. So the problem I always have is that when anyone says anything other than how Jesus has acted, about how Jesus sees our brokenness, our sinfulness, the things we think are sinful, when people make judgments on all of that and they say that they are separated from God, well, I'm sorry. Show me that in the person of Jesus. Please don't start using Old Testament scriptures to validate a statement of yours. Don't pick and choose out of Paul's letters to validate a point. Show me how Jesus, the one we have faith in, it's not Paul, and it's not the Old Testament, it's the person of Jesus. Show me how the person of Jesus behaves, and that is what I believe is the veracity of who we are as Christians. It has to be based on how Jesus behaved, and none of us are comfortable with that because it means that the institutions have taken something that was pure, honest, and for everyone, and again, they have tried to lock it up and control it, and Jesus had a problem with that the first time that he walked the earth, calling out the Sadducees and Pharisees and the high priests for how they behaved and how they locked the kingdom of heaven out against men. Tell me if some of that doesn't happen, and tell me if we haven't been, in some small way, shape, or form, manipulated into believing that God cannot love me the way I am because of who I am, and I love the comment, and you hear this a lot. If God only knew who I was, God would not love me, which is kind of just sort of ironic, right? You're talking about God, not knowing who we are. And I understand that from a human perspective. I get that. But the truth of the matter is, it is much more depth to the character and the person and the actions of Jesus. And Jesus goes back to them, and his statement of peace, I think, is specifically because they are terrified that they're in the presence of the one that they abandoned. And tell me if you and I don't go through that experience ourselves. We have a lapse of judgment. We make wrong choices. We knowingly make wrong choices. And yet, in the midst of all that, then we run and we hide and we lock ourselves up, and we're terrified that Jesus comes up, and we don't want him to show up because of how we feel. And yet, at the same time, when Jesus comes, and he does, there is nothing we can do that stops this Jesus from showing up and putting himself right in our face. It's always going to happen. You could run all you want, but you cannot hide or lock a door from God. You can't. You cannot limit this person of Jesus' love. You cannot limit his compassion and mercy. And that is problematic to us because as human beings, we don't have that experience. But here we have Jesus showing up to the very same people who abandoned him, ran away. And you would think after the death and knowing about his resurrection, they wouldn't be tied up in a room. They would be running around telling everyone that this Jesus rose from the dead. And yet they're not doing any of that. And even after he comes and visits them, they still don't go out and do that. They're still limited by who they are as human beings, and it doesn't seem to matter to Jesus because Jesus comes back when Thomas is there, and I always feel this guy gets a really bad rap. Look, if you and I, seriously, not this Thomas, he deserves everything he gets. But, I'm just saying, all right, look, it's your day, we'll let you have it. Okay. But the fact of the matter is, tell me if you were told by a group of people, I saw so-and-so risen from the dead, standing in our midst, showing us his hands and side, and he hung out for a while, and you weren't there. And everyone calls the poor guy Doubting Thomas. Really? Honestly? Tell me any of us right now, despite 2,000 years of history, that we know that the discipleship of Jesus is alive and well, and it moves through the earth, that even after 2,000 years, that we don't question, we don't doubt? Of course we do. But Jesus, really great to pick on Thomas. I'm all for it, by the way. You pick on Tom all you want. But the fact of the matter is, isn't Thomas us? And aren't we Thomas? And isn't that exactly maybe why John put it in the gospel? Was that he knew that people were going to be doubting. But yet at the same time, when Jesus came and was in their presence, Thomas was not afraid to go up. And by the way, did you notice there are 3 points here of verification? And this is just a Jewish law thing. Put your finger here and see my hands. Bring your hand and put it into my side. So it was both hands and the side is what Jesus asked. Everything in Jewish law needs to be verified 3 times. Verification 3 times. John is writing specifically so that any Jewish person reading this would know that the verification came 3 times and that Thomas was the one who did all that. If Jesus showed up and said to me, put your finger into my hands, or your hand into my side, I'm not really sure I'd be around doing that. You'd still be trying to get me up off the ground. But look at Thomas. God bless you. He's not afraid to reach out, literally. He's not afraid to put his faith at a test and to attempt and to do exactly what it is that Jesus asks him to do. And I think there's something in that spiritually for us as well. We should not be afraid to ask God for signs and proof of his presence, a sensation of his presence. We were talking about something today in the car coming over, and we were talking about how more and more we realize there are no coincidences, that God works in and through all of these situations, and that ultimately, if we look back, we can see how God's hand has guided and directed and protected and opened up opportunities and the like for us, you know? But we have to be willing to look for that. We have to be willing to look for God's activity. And I think in this regard, Jesus specifically comes back, yes, to see the other 10, but he came back for Thomas. And that's the other and last point. Thomas doubted Jesus' resurrection. And Jesus goes out of his way to make sure that he goes back for Thomas. And I'm telling you that this is a characteristic of how God is. And so when we think to ourselves that we're doubting, it's okay to doubt. And it's okay to tell God that we're doubting. Don't hide that. Who are you hiding it from? But ultimately realize the minute you say to God, I'm doubting, I need help, I need support, I need evidence of your presence, then watch out, because he'll come back just for you. God bless you.